Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is African Americans and the census of 2000. And we're fortunate to have with us a geographer from Tennessee State University, Dr. DPadgett, who is a professor in the Department of History, Geography, and Political Science, to talk about the African American and the census of 2000. And of course, Dr. Padgett, let me welcome you to the show this morning, and to tell you how delighted we are to have you with us, Dr. Padgett, because we've talked about the Census 2000 on a number of occasions, and we feel that you now can bring us the information of the results in a real sense of what we talked about earlier, and that is the outcome of some of these statements dealing with the census. But before we get into that, Dr. Padgett, let's have you to give our audience some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important that eventually led you into geography and eventually led you to Tennessee State University in the Department of History, Geography, and Political Science. And then we'll talk about the census of 2000.
Yeah, well, I began my education at the undergraduate level at Western Kentucky University, and I started out as an environmental engineering major, but things changed and I wound up majoring in geography. And of course, being a geographer, one of the main areas is the study of population and demographics and the census. These are some of the core areas of the discipline of geography. After graduating from there, I went to work for the federal government. I worked at Oak Ridge National Lab. I worked for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. And then I went on to graduate school at the University of Florida, where I continued my studies primarily in geography and environmental engineering. And so during that time, I've always had to use environmental data, especially when looking at environmental justice issues, to see what sectors of the population are being impacted, or low income or minority groups being impacted by pollution. Also, I own a consulting firm, and I've used census data and economic data to look at the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data for banks, and looked at areas that have been underserved by banks, where people, especially people of color, have not been fairly treated with regard to home loans. And so you have to use census data, census tract maps, in order to show those disparities. And so it's been something I've done all throughout my career, is use census data to look at all aspects of life.
And so what we'd like to do today, Dr. Padgett, within that framework, is to have you to talk about the census of 2000. I think that you've got a lot of information relative to some of the trends, some of the developments in reference to that. And what we'd like to do during this first segment, as well as the second segment, is to simply give you free rein to talk about this as a topic, and to sort of give us what you believe to be the most important elements that have come out of this census of 2000, dealing specifically with the African American population, and of course how that might relate to other members of society, other populations as well. But from that perspective, let's talk about it from there.
Okay. Well, the census, this year's census is going to be somewhat different. One of the big changes is in ethnic identification. We used to have 6 general racial categories: black, white, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, Asia Pacific Islander, etc. But now there are 63 different racial categorizations. And you still have the same 6 main racial categories, but now people who responded to the census were able to choose from amongst 63 various racial categorizations, and they were able to choose more than one. And there's some concern amongst the African American community that that's going to cut into our representation with regard to voting districts and congressional representation, because there are some people of African descent who might feel that, well, I'm more Native American and African American, or I'm maybe African American European, or what have you. And so there was a movement in front, especially in California, to push black people to check black and nothing else on that census, because there was a fear that we lose representation.
Well, in looking at the African American representation, and you say that there were the general 6 groups prior to this census. Now, What are some of, as an example for the African American, what are some of the other choices out of that 63 number that an African American who at one time might have been could have only been an African American, what are some of the other choices that that individual would have?
Well, there's any number of choices. You could be African American and Native American, African American, Latino, African American, European, African American, mixed with any number of those racial categorizations.
And that would still make you African American, but that would also take away from that total number of African Americans. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, theoretically, you would be in a mixed race category. You'd be other than purely African American. And so some see that as perhaps diluting our representation.
Now, what impact would this have to dilute the African American representation in the census?
Well, coming out of last year's election, I mean, there's always been the observance that minority groups, especially blacks, have been undercounted. What the census does is they take the official count, and then using various statistical methods, they project the population between the census years. So they would project the population for 1997 based upon 1990 data. However, what we've been finding is that the actual census count often is beneath those projected totals. So the expected African American percentage of the population is usually below what we get in the census count. So what is believed is that that's what's called the census undercount, which obviously is going to cut into the number of representatives from a given area, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level. And so, you know, we saw in this recent election that and to some degree led to some of the problems that we saw in Florida and even here in Nashville.
If you look at the overall African American population from the census, what would be the percentage of the African American population in this country?
Well, we range from approximately 12.7 to 13% of the population. That's out of 281 million as of the last count. However, there are a lot of people who argue against that, saying, no, we're actually 15%, 16% of the population because we're undercounted. And, you know, there are reasons for that. A lot of times the people who actually go out and do the census enumeration do not want to go into African American communities. And sometimes the estimations are conducted by counting households, and we know it's just a fact that African American households contain more people than white households, and so the undercount occurs that way. So there are a variety of reasons for the undercount that can have serious impacts, especially with regard to political representation.
Okay, looking at this census, Dr. Padgett, give our audience some of the things that you believe to be important. That is, looking at this overall census of 2000, and as a geographer and as a person involved in the environment, what do you see and what can you tell our audience this morning about this census?
Well, as I mentioned before, the new racial designations, and that's important. Also, the undercount, the fact that we're being undercounted, that's also important. But also, we can look at some trends that I'll get into later. And see where African Americans are moving, where African Americans are living, where we're distributed geographically. I mean, we are much more likely to live in urban areas than other population groups, especially more than whites. And if you look at the outcome of this most recent election, there was a split, I mean, a clear division between a geographical division for who voted for Gore and who voted for Bush. Clearly, Bush dominated the more rural, suburban areas where white people live, and African Americans and voted for Gore, and he had a stronger presence in inner cities.
In urban America.
Yes.
And so you see that as a great trend in terms of the census, a great breakdown in terms of where African Americans and other groups are located in the United States. And of course, Dr. Padgett, let us have this short commercial break, and after which we'll come back for our second segment, and we'll give you an opportunity to continue this discussion. We'll be back with you following this short commercial.